All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something pretty fundamental to how all of us learners out there actually function, and that's the really interesting connection between our emotions and the way we learn. We've got some research lined up that looks at this idea that feelings aren't just kind of passively along for the ride when we're learning something new. They might actually be a lot more involved, like they're really steering the car.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's not just about feelings being present, they're really active in the process. And to help us get into that, we're going to use this framework called the Dynamical Components Systems approach to emotions. So you can kind of forget about that old idea of emotions as just simple feelings that pop up out of nowhere. This approach sees them as this much more dynamic process with all these different parts constantly interacting, influencing each other, all as we learn.
Okay, so dynamical component systems, that's a bit of a mouthful. Can we break that down a little? What is this framework actually telling us about how emotions work when we're in the thick of learning something new?
Basically, it's a newer way of looking at how our thinking, our emotions, what motivates us, even our willpower, they're not all these separate boxes. They're all linked, they're connected, and they're always influencing each other. And a key part of this is that it views emotions not as just this static feeling, like just being happy or sad, but as this dynamic process that's unfolding over time as we engage with, new information or a new skill.
So it's not just a snapshot of how I feel at one moment, but more like a movie of how my whole system reacts and changes as I go through something.
Exactly. A movie is a great analogy. And the research, like Scherer back in 2004, identified 5 key interacting components that make up an emotional experience. They're like the actors in our movie. So first, you have the cognitive component. This is how we're interpreting and evaluating the events and the objects around us. Then there's the neurophysiological component. This is all about our body's responses, like changes in our heart rate, hormone levels, all those things that regulate our arousal. Then we have motor expression. This is about how our emotions kind of show outwardly, like through facial expressions or body language. And then there's the motivational component. This gets us ready for action, it directs our behavior. And finally, there's the subjective feeling component, which is our own internal awareness of what's happening and how we're interacting with the situation.
So it really is a whole production happening in there.
Uh,
Emotions aren't just this one-dimensional happy, sad, angry. It's this whole synchronized dance of my thoughts, my body, my expressions, motivations, my internal sense of everything. And it's all happening at once, while I'm trying to learn this new thing.
Exactly. And it all feeds into each other,
Yeah, absolutely. So can we maybe make this a little more concrete? I mean, can you give us an example of how this might play out for someone who's listening to this right now, like they're in a typical learning situation?
Sure. Let's imagine you're reading a chapter for a course, and let's say you're Fran, because some research uses that name. Now, initially, you might be just reading along, not really feeling anything too strongly, but then all of a sudden you realize, oh no, I'm only halfway through this chapter and I have like no time left before we have to discuss this in class. And that's when all those components we just talked about, they can really kick in. You've got that cognitive appraisal of the time pressure. Oh, I'm running out of time. And that can trigger this neurophysiological response. Maybe you get a little jolt of adrenaline. Then this could lead to a motor expression. Maybe you frown a little bit, you tense up, and then your motivation changes. Maybe you start trying to read faster, or you decide, okay, I'm just going to skim the rest of this. And then there's that subjective feeling of anxiety, pressure as you become aware of the ticking clock and the need to understand this material.
So it's like this little time crunch just totally transformed this simple act of reading into like a cascade of all these interconnected emotional responses.
Right. It shows how even like the most mundane learning activities are actually emotionally charged.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can see how those different parts fire up and they're connecting. It's not just one feeling, it's this whole cascade, right?
And it is.
And it sounds like these components aren't just acting in isolation.
Right. They can operate somewhat independently. But what makes it an emotional experience is when they become synchronized, when they start influencing each other. That interconnectedness is what creates that specific emotion we feel.
But so then we get to this idea of mutual regulation. They're influencing each other back and forth, right?
Yeah.
It's not just one thing triggers another in a straight line.
Exactly. That's a key principle.
Yeah.
They're mutually regulating each other over time within a specific context through these feedback loops. It's like this constant negotiation going on inside you between your thoughts, your body's reactions, your urges to act, and your feelings. All those things are constantly influencing each other.
And there was this thing in the research about course processing and then these more refined microcycles. Can you explain that a bit more? What's going on there?
Yeah, so researchers like Lewis suggest that these emotional processes, they often start with a more automatic kind of subconscious course processing. Think of it like your brain quickly scanning a room, getting this general sense of the atmosphere before you zero in on specific details. So you get this initial sense of a situation, is it potentially threatening, rewarding, relevant? And then this initial broad interpretation kind of kicks off these recursive feedback processes, these microcycles among the different components, and that leads to more refined evaluations, and then a more specific, coordinated emotional experience emerges.
So maybe in a classroom, can you give an example of how this might play out for a learner, like this rapid back and forth happening?
Let's say your teacher walks into the room carrying this stack of papers. Now, your initial maybe course processing might just register papers and trigger this, slight feeling of uncertainty. But then you notice the teacher's not putting down their usual materials and they're starting to hand out these papers. And that uncertainty might quickly become apprehension, especially if you weren't expecting a pop quiz or something. But then as you receive the paper and see that it's an announcement about a field trip you were hoping for, all that apprehension can quickly shift to relief. And then that relief might even turn into excitement as you realize, oh, we're actually going. All those shifts can happen so fast, within seconds, because your initial general appraisal is being rapidly updated as you get more information and your internal systems are adjusting accordingly.
Wow, that's a whole emotional roller coaster just from seeing a stack of papers.
Right.
And the research also mentioned junior high students working on math problems. How did their experience with this kind of vary? Show this dynamic nature of emotion.
Yeah, it was a really cool study. They followed 16 students working on some complex math problems over a few lessons. And what they found was these really detailed moment to moment changes in the students' emotions as they struggled with the tasks. Like, take Belinda, for instance. She is trying to solve this problem with several parts. And the researchers tracked her emotional shifts through questionnaires and interviews. The data is shown conceptually in Figure 1, but basically it shows how she starts off feeling sad because of something that happened before class. Then, as she's struggling with the first part of this problem, that sadness kind of shifts to annoyance. But then she moves to a different part of the problem. She finds it easier, and boom, her emotion changes to confidence. But as she runs into more difficulties, the annoyance returns, it gradually intensifies into frustration, and then finally it's anger, like she's angry at herself for not getting it. But then as the class ends, she feels the sense of relief. It's over.
So we really see how emotions, they're not fixed, they're not static when we're learning. There's this constant flow and change depending on what's happening with the problem itself, but also what's going on inside, internally for her. It's
Yeah.
like everything's influencing everything else.
Yeah, exactly. And this really highlights that third principle that these emotional reactions, they're fundamentally shaped by the context they're happening in.
So it's not just about what's happening in my head, but also about the specific environment and situation I'm in.
Absolutely. Your component systems don't just adjust to each other, they're also constantly responding to changes in the social environment or that specific learning context. And those appraisals, those initial interpretations we make, they're always rooted in a particular context. So it's not just the immediate elements like the teacher's instructions or how difficult the task is, it's also the meaning you attach to the situation based on your prior knowledge and beliefs. And the research, especially from a socio-constructivist perspective, emphasizes that those knowledge and beliefs are largely social in nature. They're shaped by our interactions with others and the world around us.
So it's like my belief about whether I'm good at something, like say math, it didn't just appear out of thin air. It's got this whole history behind it, right?
Right, exactly. So your beliefs about math learning, they're influenced by all sorts of things. Your past experiences in math classes, the attitudes and expectations around math in your home and culture, your parents' own beliefs about math, even these broader societal messages about who is supposed to excel in math. The research by McLeod back in '92 and then Oppenstein and his colleagues in 2002, they really highlight these social and contextual influences.
And so the classroom itself, that specific environment where I'm actually doing the learning, that also plays a big role, right?
Absolutely. Because what gets defined as mathematical knowledge, what's considered the right way to solve a problem, what kinds of questions are seen as okay to ask, all of that is shaped by the norms, the rules, and the practices within that specific classroom community. It's like this taken as shared understanding, as Yackel and Kopp talked about in '96. So your own individual understanding and beliefs about math learning are really tied up with these shared understandings within the classroom.
So when I feel something in a math class, it's not just about the numbers on the page in front of me. It's also about like my whole history with math,
Hmm.
what I believe about my own abilities, and even these subtle cues and expectations within that specific classroom. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it is. And it's all intertwined. So that situatedness of emotions in the classroom, it's constructed in two main ways. First, through your individual relationship with the specific situation, how you immediately interpret the task, the teacher's feedback, your interaction with your classmates. And second, through the social nature of the knowledge and beliefs that you bring to that situation, which have been shaped by your broader experiences. And Paris and Turner's work on situated motivation back in '94 really fits in with this. They emphasize that emotions are situated because they're based on these cognitive interpretations, but they're also influenced by your individual background and they're contextualized within specific events. And they're always changing as the situation develops and as your understanding of it develops.
So we've talked about how emotions are dynamic, they're interconnected, and they're heavily influenced by the context. Now, this fourth principle, self-organization and attractors, can we unpack that a bit? It sounds like things are kind of settling into more predictable patterns, even with all this potential for variation.
That's a great way to put it. So
Mhm.
even with all these almost infinite possibilities for interactions between all those component systems we've been talking about, emotional experiences tend to self-organize into relatively stable patterns. Researchers call these attractors. You can imagine like a ball rolling around on this hilly landscape. The valleys in that landscape, those are the attractors. That's where the ball, your emotional state, tends to settle most easily. Because of the slopes around it, representing your stable beliefs and experiences, it just naturally kind of rolls into those valleys.
Okay, so what decides where those valleys, those stable patterns are located? What shapes those attractors?
It's all grounded in those relatively stable beliefs, goals, and concerns that we have, both as individuals and within that broader social and historical context that we exist in. And they provide a degree of stability, predictability to our emotional lives. So, for example, these stable patterns can explain why we can often recognize and label what we think of as basic emotions like anger, fear, joy. These labels, they often correspond to these common configurations of those underlying component systems.
Okay, so there are some patterns that tend to emerge, and the research uses the example of shame. Can you explain how that fits into this attractor idea?
Sure. So, work by Turner and Schaller, they highlighted how shame often emerges from a perceived failure in something that's personally important to you. So, you interpret the event as a failure, especially if it clashes with your expectations, and you attribute that failure to your own shortcomings. And that creates a pretty consistent cognitive pattern that's associated with shame. And this cognitive pattern is often paired with these characteristic physiological responses, like your heart rate increasing, feeling hot, as well as these typical motivational tendencies, like wanting to withdraw or hide. So that recurring clustering of cognitive, physiological, and motivational components, that's the attractor for the emotion of shame.
So even though the specific situation that triggers shame might be different, like maybe failing a test versus making a social blunder, the underlying pattern of my thoughts, my bodily sensations, and my urges, those tend to be pretty similar.
Yeah, exactly. And as individuals, we develop our own consistent emotional patterns over time. It's like our own habitual ways of responding emotionally because we tend to gravitate towards certain attractors based on our values, past experiences, our ingrained beliefs. And Paquerin's control value theory of academic emotions gives us this framework for understanding how your initial beliefs about how much control you have over your learning and how much you value academic success can influence your appraisals of learning situations and then your subsequent emotional and motivational responses. So they're essentially creating attractors for certain kinds of emotional experiences in those academic settings.
So it's almost like some things are just more likely to make us feel certain ways because of these patterns. But the research also mentioned this idea of sensitive dependence on initial conditions. And that sounds like even with these patterns, there's still room for variation, right? For unexpected turns.
Absolutely. So while we have these stable attractor patterns, and they do provide some predictability, there are always these subtle variations because of individual differences. Our unique backgrounds, our knowledge, our beliefs, all that plays a role. And then the very specific details of the learning context matter too. So that sensitive dependence on initial conditions, It basically means that even small differences in how an emotional experience starts can lead to bigger differences in how it unfolds over time. So that's why, the frustration you feel when you're stuck on a math problem, that might feel different from the frustration you experience when you're trying to learn a new instrument, for example. Or why even two students who both feel frustrated in the same classroom might have slightly different underlying patterns of their component systems and therefore different subjective experiences of that frustration.
So even though we might use the same word, like frustration, to label it, what's actually happening under the surface could be pretty different for different people.
Exactly. And recognizing that complexity is key to understanding how emotions and learning are truly intertwined.
So, to bring it all together, what are the main takeaways from this dynamical component systems approach? How does it change how we understand learning and how each of us, as learners, experience it?
The big takeaway is that we should be understanding learning as this deeply situated process that involves the ongoing interaction of our cognitive, emotional, motivational, and even volitional processes. Emotions, they're not just these sidekicks to learning, popping up alongside it. They're actively influencing and are influenced by how we think, how motivated we feel to learn, and how we actually engage with learning tasks.
So how should research on learning, how should that change to reflect this more complex understanding?
Well, research needs to start adopting what Cobb and Bowers call an actor's perspective. That means focusing on the learner's own appraisals and interpretations of those learning situations, rather than just relying on observing their behavior from this outside viewpoint. Methodologically, that means moving beyond those traditional methods like questionnaires that we give after learning has happened. We need to incorporate more classroom-based research using things like in-depth interviews, detailed observations of the interactions happening, analysis of classroom discussions, even real-time tracking techniques like experience sampling where learners are reporting on their feelings as they're actually learning, and video-stimulated recall where they reflect on their emotions while watching recordings of their learning. Now, reliably measuring all the different components of emotion in, the messiness of a real classroom, that's still a challenge. But these diverse approaches, they offer much richer, more nuanced insights into that lived experience of learning.
So it's like we need this multifaceted approach to really get a complete picture.
Exactly. We need this multidimensional approach that examines emotions in relation to those cognitive and motivational processes, but also a multi-level approach that takes into account those personal factors, the interpersonal interactions within the learning environment, and the broader community and cultural influences. Like researchers Opetind and Rogoff have emphasized, that's what's crucial for a deeper, more comprehensive understanding of how emotions shape our learning journeys.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, it seems like the dynamical component systems approach gives us this much more powerful, nuanced lens for understanding the role of emotions in our learning.
Definitely. It moves us away from those overly simplistic views of emotions as just, positive or negative, and shows us how they're these complex dynamic processes that are really integral to how we think, how motivated we are, and how we act within those environments where learning happens.
And understanding that has the potential to be really impactful, right? Both for educators, so they can design more effective instruction and provide better support for students, and for us as learners, so we can be more aware of and effectively navigate the emotional landscape of our own learning experiences.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought for all of you learners out there. Take a moment to think about your own emotions. Even those subtle shifts in feeling that you might not even consciously register. How could they be shaping your understanding and your level of engagement with new information? What might you learn about your own learning process if you paid closer, more thoughtful attention to those internal dynamics as you encounter new ideas and challenges?
Lots to think about. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time.
Thanks for having me.